So we now move into the programme. We're going to kick off with the George Griffin lecture. And before we do, Edwin Chilvers is going to say a few words and then hand over to Michael Arthur. This is a bit scary. When I was in Cambridge, Edwin was my boss. Now I'm at UCL, Michael's my boss. I am surrounded by people who tell me what to do. And on that note, Edwin.
So I'm Edwin Chilvers from the Department of Medicine at Cambridge, and the APAM executive have just asked me to give you a few words of introduction about the George Griffin lecture. Those of you with good memories will know that there used to be something called the Association of Clinical Professors of Medicine, which George oversaw for a large number of years, and that organisation was responsible for organising 2 lectures each year, and one of them was always the start lecture for the annual APAM meeting. And it took a broader view of some of the issues that run our life. And previously we had people like Stephen Holgate talk about the REF 2014 exercise. We've had Vicky Osgood from the GMC talking about the shape of training. And most recently, I think we had John Tuke talking about the future of our medical schools. So that's the flavour of these lectures. I took over from George, and I only achieved 2 things. One is I switched that organisation off in that we amalgamated with APAM. And secondly, to assuage my guilt, I persuaded APAM to name the lecture after George Griffin. So George is neither dead nor is he paying for this lecture. That's very important for you to know. And he's here today. And I hope very much that you'll look forward to it. So this is the last time that I'll make this announcement. It's now been running for 2 years, but Professor Arthur, all yours.
Ed, David, ladies and gentlemen, let me add my welcome to UCL. You're in the Darwin Lecture Theatre. I've never precisely checked the GPS coordinates, but I believe that we're within 100 metres of where Darwin's back garden used to be. He lived for many years on Gower Street after coming back from his tour to the Galapagos and so on with Fitzroy. So welcome to this very historic place. It's the first time I've been to the Association of Physicians since around about 2005 when I was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds. I remember the meeting was in Nottingham, and you took such pity upon me for becoming a Vice-Chancellor that you made me an honorary life member. So thank you very much for that. It's the first time I've appeared in front of you since you gave me that honorific award. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, our first speaker, to give the Griffin lecture, and that is Professor Jonathan Montgomery, who's Professor of Healthcare Law here at UCL. He joined UCL in 2013. Jonathan and I have known each other for many years because we were both professors on the faculty at the University of Southampton through the 1990s and the early part of the 2000s. Jonathan has a very distinguished career and makes a tremendous contribution to public service. So he's currently chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. That's the nearest that the UK has to a national bioethics committee. He's chair of the Health Research Authority. That's the organisation that protects the interests of patients, participants and public in health research. We all have reason to be extremely grateful to Jonathan because he is previously chair of the Advisory Committee on Clinical Excellence Awards from 2005 to 14. He also has chaired the Human Genetics Commission. In Southampton and Wessex, he made a major contribution to the NHS, served on local NHS boards in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight for over 20 years and was chair of one of those for 15 years. And he's also chaired the UK Clinical Research Collaboration Working Party on a strategy for brain tissue banking, and a member of the Committee on Ethical Aspects of the Pandemic Influenza and Organ Donation Task Force. His own work is widely recognised as both having redefined his subject and made a significant contribution to its theoretical understanding. So the 3 principles of his approach are, first, that the subject area is definitely better understood as healthcare law rather than medical law. Secondly, the widespread assumption that medical law is concerned with subjecting doctors to legal regulation in order to promote ethical goals misrepresents the practice of lawmakers. We mostly seek to integrate professional norms into legal practice and reinforce them rather than challenge them. And finally, the third element of his profile is that he believes that more attention needs to be paid to the need to legitimate legal interventions in healthcare ethics. So I can think of no one better to speak to us on the subject of making the UK a great place to do research, the opportunities and challenges. Professor Jonathan Montgomery, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, now my boss, a colleague previously. Can I thank the association for the opportunity to be here and talk to you? Thank Professor Griffin for clearly being a major inspiration, and hard luck having to sit through all these now that they're named after you. I guess I should both welcome you to UCL as a UCL person and thank UCL as the Chair of the Health Research Authority for the opportunity to be here. So my half hour is to be taken up with what I imagine is a shared agenda, discussing how we can continue to make the UK a great place to do health and social care research, but particularly focusing on the opportunities and perhaps some of the challenges that face us in doing so. So when we were created in 2011 as the Health Research Authority, we set out as our aim to work collaboratively in order to make the UK a great place to undertake health research and building confidence and a wide participation base in that research with the purpose of improving the nation's health. So that's an ambition that recognises that we need to move from being good to being great. We already punch above our weight in the UK in many ways, but it's a slightly fragile system. And I want to talk to you this morning about some elements of system where I think we're making reasonable progress, and some elements of culture where I think we have some very significant challenges to address. But we built into that the word confidence, because confidence of the public in the research enterprise, confidence in those people who commit their money to do it in the UK, your confidence in terms of research and clinicians' confidence in terms of using that information are all a really important set of questions and issues if we want to hope that doing great research also improves the nation's health. So I see this as an attempt to create a virtuous circle, and one that links very closely to our aspirations for the National Health Service in England, formulated in the NHS Constitution, and which is the part of the UK that the Health Research Authority has formal responsibility for, albeit that we want to work in partnership with our colleagues in the other administrations and governments, and that most of what we're trying to do needs to work seamlessly across the system. So the NHS Constitution opens up by saying that the NHS belongs to the people of the nation, but also promises that it's going to work at the limits of science, bringing the highest levels of human knowledge and skill to save lives and improve health. That's what you might describe as a utopian vision of what we would all like to achieve. And it's in quite significant contrast to the underpinning assumptions of research ethics and governance, which are pretty dystopian. They're assumed that things go wrong. They hark back to the Nuremberg war trials. The Declaration of Helsinki commits us to making sure that the goal of medical knowledge and science doesn't take precedence over the rights and interests of research subjects and participants. So while we have a utopian dream, we also have to worry about the possibility that things go wrong. And I don't think we've quite got that in balance. So the Health Research Authority has a single objective. This is a single objective. It may not look like it, but that's what the statute says, to protect and promote. And one of the very first things that I had to do when I joined the Health Research Authority was to respond to a letter from the British Medical Association complaining about the fact that we appeared to be giving up on the protection in the interest of promotion. And surely the new Health Research Authority was being pushed by the government to encourage research to happen without due regard to the protection of participants. Well, that really isn't the way that we see it. We see these issues as complementary, and we operate by separating out the work that we support at the Health Research Authority in terms of research ethics committees, the confidentiality advisory group that looks at questions about access to data, which we ensure are fiercely independent, with the work we try and do in order to create a climate in which people have the opportunity to participate in research and have confidence to do so in a way that they believe is doing some good and will be safe and worthwhile for them to do. So we build out of our discussions with patients, public and participants, and they all have slightly different views, as I shall come back to, a strong desire to participate in the enterprise of health and social care research. They expect the care that they get to be based on good evidence, and they're very surprised when they discover that evidence is a more elusive concept than they imagined. They expect to discover that the NHS is working in a way that's going to care for them and improve the quality of care for the future. And we can tell by various proxy measures that they have a significant appetite for research. UK Biobank had no difficulty in recruiting its participants. A lot of money gets put into health research charities. We can look in some areas, such as cancers, as exceptionally high participation rates in research by patients. There's a clear desire to do this. And it's not a question about the interests of research participants being to have no research and the interests of clinicians and researchers to have lots of research. Actually, it's about squaring that circle and making it complementary. So we need to do that through both systems and culture. I brought my visual aid with me. This was a present from a disgruntled customer in the NHS in Hampshire, who on a couple of occasions told me I was so bound up in red tape that I couldn't actually see the purpose of what's going on. So I periodically revisit my bundle of red tape to remind me of what's going on. So the Health Research Authority is the guardian of many of the systems that either can help or maybe will hinder us. We aim to try and make the systems work for the reasons that they're intended. So we started off right at the very beginning, actually on day one. We integrated the Gene Therapy Advisory Committee, which was taking months to take decisions because it didn't meet very frequently, into the standard operating procedure of one of our ethics committees. And it was with great pleasure that Janet Wisely, the Chief Executive, and I fielded a question on, I think it was about day 3 at an NHR meeting about what are you going to do about GTAC, and we said, well, we did it. You just didn't notice. And that does seem to have been working. We also try and pick off things that shouldn't be system problems, but are in practice. And so one of the early things we were able to do in consultation and collaboration with the MRHA was to point out that not everybody involved in a research project, even if they never saw a patient, had to have GCP training. And I will welcome any little niggles like that we can just take away and sort while I'm here this morning. This year, we've been trying to pick off some opportunities and address some challenges. So we saw an opportunity with the new clinical trials regulation to sharpen up our ability to do pragmatic and cluster trials, and we published guidance on appropriate consent processes for that. We've agreed a work program with our colleagues to iron out some of the wrinkles in cross-border research. And I have to say, I've said this at a number of occasions, we are about to launch a new policy framework for health research to replace the governance framework for health research, putting the emphasis on doing the research, not the emphasis on holding it back. And it's just held up in the politics of securing approval from all of the constituent nations. We can issue it for England, but our colleagues need to go through political processes. So these are little things that we can chip away and improve the system. But the big problem has been the underlying governance system that was the very purpose behind the establishment of the HRA. So this is a one-slide summary of the challenges that Mike Rawlings identified in the report for the Academy of Medical Sciences 2011. We were losing ground. We used to have a lot of a market share, and we were losing it. And what's more, the people we wanted to attract in to come and do work with us were not expecting to increase their investment. They were expecting to reduce it. And why, when asked, they suggested that the complexity of our approach to regulation and governance was a significant limiting factor for the process. So our biggest single job, although it doesn't quite appear in these terms in the legislation, was to try and solve that complexity problem. The Rawlings review identified that there was overlap in getting permissions, that led to considerable complexity, inconsistency, and therefore delay, that it couldn't properly be related to the proportionality of risks that patients are suffering. And two big things that I think those things we've made some inroads in. Two big things that still remain, that we've failed to deliver on what ought to be an obvious USP for the UK, which is that we have a socialised medicine system and the ability to gather patient data together in as near as possible real-world contexts. And somehow we've tied ourselves in knots in unlocking that. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And it's linked to the final one, which was a perception of unsupportive NHS culture. And I think we've made some progress on that, but I still think it's a major challenge. So just very quickly, why do I think we've made some progress? Well, we're beginning to see some recovery in terms of the clinical trials context, and that's because that's where the industry money is, that's where the monitoring is easier. If you look at it in terms of the competition against Europe, we're still only about a tenth of what goes on in the States, but we're picking up, particularly in relation to phase 1 trials, and we're competing towards the top of the pack in the others. What Brexit will do to that, we shall remain to see. But we are seeing greater investment confidence from the industry and getting positive feedback from the APBI. And what's been the big idea? Well, the big idea on this is Health Research Authority approval as a new type of service. And what we picked up when we talked to people about where the problems lay, the problem seemed to lay in that the NHS was worried about too much of the picture. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you've got all the things that local NHS organisations thought they should do themselves and take responsibility for. And on the right-hand side, you've got the regulators' processes on which they had direct control. And by and large, those regulator processes went reasonably smoothly. That wasn't an easy thing to do. That's been achieved over a decade or so leading up to this. We brought a system in place where you only had to go to one ethics committee, and that worked for the whole of the country, and that resolved one of the duplication problems. And we were left with a lack of similar coordination and streamlining in the NHS. So essentially the plan has been to take those NHS concerns and try and make sure that we do them once and not lots of times, and move them into the remit of the HRA. So what we now have through HRA approval is a series of things that we can provide as a service to the NHS, confirming and giving assurance of the ethics of the process, its compliance with various legal requirements, taking away the idea of having to solve separately for every site these various questions about legal compliance. And that should leave, when it works, the NHS only asking itself, can we do it here? Now, we haven't quite got to making that work. We have particular challenges, I think, in persuading people to accept common material transfer agreements and contracts, but we have made significant steps in the right direction. It should feel, for the researchers now, about essentially you have two key stages before you get your approval, which will wrap up together the ethics approval and the various legal compliance and other assurances. We should work on the basis that you have to give us the package to be checked, We look at it, we come back to you once, is the theory, with all the things that we need to clarify on, and then we can move to a rapid approval. And we have a very nice little animation. This is a screenshot from it, which now says how it should work. Now, there is some evidence that it's beginning to move in that direction. So this is our timelines for HRA approval, and you can see that we had some significant capacity questions as we ramped up, but we're now beginning to move in the right sort of direction, whereby the time it takes to do what were the old R&D approvals is beginning to come down to what we hope are useful and, most importantly, predictable timelines. So that has the bit that was new to the HRA. This puts together the median timelines in relation to the length of time that should happen from it coming to us and it going out the door with the relevant approvals. We still have a reasonable amount of time taken up in RECs against the timetable, but that looks good internationally, and the add-on in red is looking much better and much nearer where we should be. I want to come back to some of the problems in a moment. So we're beginning to be able to monitor what's the impact of this on the obstruction of the bureaucracy. And in the Rawlings report, they cited a now infamous figure from Cancer Research UK of it taking 621 days to get from the decision to fund treatment to actually be able to recruit the first patient. So we're trying to get closer to whether we can monitor that in the current system. And we've looked at the last quarter prior to the introduction of HRA approval and the last quarter that we have data for, and we're certainly making some purchase on that set of timelines. So we can see that although NIHR and others had done significant work in improving against the 621, we are looking at something that now is nearer to what we are hoping for. And we have a few big successes. We have an Amgen trial in which we managed to get the first global site set up and the first patient recruited in a global study. So we do know that it can work. And we know that it's working more of the time than it used to. So in many ways, we think we should not tinker now with the systems. We should allow them to bed down. And what we need to concentrate on is the culture that has to go with that to really make it work. So the second set of things I want to talk about is the cultural change that remains a challenge and what we're doing about it. So first of all, we need to do a lot more about our own work. So we're kicking off in consultation with users of our systems a service improvement program, and the plan is to identify how we can get to this aspiration of it feeling good to you, the users of the system. It should feel like a service to you, not feeding the beast. And I know that's going to take a reprovision of our IT before we really get it feeling like that, but we can get a long way towards that. We should get to the system where we can not just monitor median timelines, but we can be much more specific about what you should expect as a researcher coming through, so that then you don't have to keep checking whether or not you're in track. And we should be able to get to a system where you can monitor that for yourselves. And we've identified a whole load of waste in the system. We need to get to the stage where there's only one point at which we check whether we have all the things that are necessary. I'll come back to that in a moment. We've identified that we have 13 points at which we check for documentation, and we can certainly get those down to 5. And we've identified about 13 points where we communicate with you or other partners about it, and we can certainly get those down to 5. Hopefully when we're down to 5, we can get them down further. And so there's a whole bit of work going on within the HRA to try and get the culture right to go with that system's aspiration. But there are two challenges I want to talk about which I think are in your territory and you may be able to help me with. The first is that I'm really worried that we change what we do and it has very little impact on the overall pattern of the research. So what happens outside of the systems that we can change and why? So this is a slide we monitor which looks at what we call pre-Health Research Authority approval applications. So these are applications that were approved by ethics committees before April 2016. And we're still getting a trickle of them coming in for us to approve. So even if we are quick in our bit there, something is delaying the system and stopping things coming to us. And there may be lots of other behaviours that we're just not getting traction on in the system that we can't really solve unless we know where the hold-ups are. And I'm hoping I'll get some clues on that from you later. The second is, why do you find the system so hard? So I talked about the need to have a validation point. If we look at whether or not when things come into our systems, they actually have all the documents that are needed to be checked to say that things are going to comply and ready to go, we find that roughly a third don't have ready the material that we've got. So that's going to waste everybody's time. It means we have to look at it more than once. It means we have to keep coming back to you and colleagues and dealing with it. So what is it that's so hard about getting that process right? Part of it is our IT is very clunky, and part of it is we haven't been very clear, perhaps, about what's expected, and part of it may be that there are not yet sufficiently ambitious expectations of what we can do. So people think, I'll get it in because then I can come back and sort it out later. So there's some cultural challenges, I think, for us that picked up, some cultural challenges for the research community that we need to pick up, and there are still some major cultural challenges in the provider side of the health services. What we need is to create a can-do R&D culture, where the R&D departments are doing now, I guess most universities experience this, what our research support people do is that they keep saying, have you thought of applying for this? Do you know there's this call for funding? Not checking whether you filled in the forms correctly and done your spelling. Now, what we pick up from the informal feedback is we've made considerable progress on this at the top and bottom of organisations. So if you talk to frontline research and development offices, they're keen to get things started. They see the value of it. They're quite excited about the opportunities. If you talk to chief executives and medical directors, they tell you what a wonderful organisation they have. And somewhere in the middle are a whole load of inertia principles, that the middle management, the performance indications still make people think, I'm safer if it doesn't happen than I am if I do something and it's risky. So I think we've made some inroads into that, but it's still a major problem. We hear the same about the regulatory systems. The MRHA and we're told, are very, very helpful when you talk to us, but the standard operating procedures, the inspection regimes still feel finicky and focused on the detail. So what can we do about shifting that? Well, the sort of discussions we're having at the moment is how could we get into the things that matter to NHS organisations, the incentives to do this right and do it better. We already require, through NIHR, reporting on numbers of patients recruited to trials. How can we get that into the CQC system? I'm meeting with Mike Richards to discuss that shortly in the hope we can get in before he leaves CQC. Discussions about how you can make boards see that this matters. We know that organisations that are research intensive are broadly better. We can't say that you're better off being in a research trial because the data doesn't really support that. We can say you're better off in an organisation that does research, and we should push that through. And we should integrate it into the way in which NHS organisations service and support their communities. So the Citizen Scientist Initiative in Sir David Dawson's Trust in Salford I thought was really interesting. I went up to learn about citizen science. I didn't really learn anything about citizen science. What I learned was it's really well integrated into the community. So it works as citizen scientists, as they call it, actually because Salford is regarded as something that is really interested in their local community, built on the back of the Salford lung study, and it's integrated into their general feeling of responsiveness to the public. So that leads me to think that we shouldn't think the UK public, or if you talk to the people who work in this area, publics, because there are various subsets, are a problem in this. No. We know that the vast majority of people think health research is important, 97%. We know that large numbers of people are prepared to go into trials, and we know that the majority of people think they should be given the opportunity to participate. So we know broadly that people are supportive of research. We know that the closer you are, the more supportive you are. So the general public is a bit more cynical and worried than the patients and the participants, but even they are supportive. We know that when it hits the public, it gets usually a pretty clear wind. So despite its misguided understanding of the law and the impacts, the public concern for innovation that was manifested in the support for the SARTG bill is really important. We've been able to get broad public support for moving forward on mitochondrial replacement therapies in a way that other countries have found difficult. We're engaging in a debate about embryo research beyond 14 days. All those things, what we get is a groundswell of enthusiasm and encouragement that we need to harness. Public opinion surveys tell us that the public they trust doctors, they generally trust scientists, they even find regulation a reassuring thing, that they like the fact that there are research ethics committees, but they don't trust industry, which is a big problem because we really can't do this except in partnership. So I want to reflect a little on why I think it's been so difficult to realise that promise of unlocking the health service data. What are the lessons from the care.data fiasco that I draw that make me think about how we might move it forward? Well, I think the first thing is it's not very surprising that the public doesn't trust us when clinicians don't trust us. So when the Google DeepMind issues emerge from the Royal Free, and there are issues there which we're working through and have to get right, it's academics who raise the concern. When care.data is trying to be pushed, it's the GPs who undermine it. I have to say that's a long-standing problem. It was the same with all the work around MPFIT and the electronic record. The GPs are suspicious because it breaks down their power base. I'm a big believer in electronic care records and transfer because it stops patients being locked into the people that they've seen previously. Clinicians are suspicious then. Politicians keep talking about how wonderful a commercial opportunity it is. The 100,000 Genome Project was all about David Cameron's idea of inviting inward investment and then had to be turned into something that actually might be clinically useful. But pretty much everybody other than the politicians is suspicious about this being exploitative and misappropriating things. So we've lost the connection between the care and the research. And that, I think, is also true of the way in which researchers talk about what they do. They're not very good at linking it with the benefits that matter to individuals. They're good at linking it, because we invite them to hype this, with what the world might be like a long time in the future, but they're not very good at explaining why I should care about this now. And we can't really expect our publics to think we can be trusted with data when actually we can't make our data systems work very well. We really need to be trustworthy in terms of that. So what essentially I think we need is we need to reframe the conversation that we're having about the use of data. We need to link it to what it is we're trying to achieve for the public themselves. So they don't feel done to, they feel participants in a project. So for me, this means that I want to talk to patients and the public, and I want to say, what do you want from the NHS, your health services? And I think they will buy into an idea. Well, the first thing they want to know is that they're going to be there when they need them or their family needs them. When they're there, they're going to want to know that actually they're effective, and that requires an evidence base, that they're appropriate for them and their families, and that means we need to know a lot more than we can learn from RCTs about what goes on in the real world. And they want to know it's safe for them to take them. They broadly think these things just happen as a matter of course, and they're quite surprised when they discover we don't really know. They also expect the NHS to be learning and trying to make those things better for them. And they're completely used to the idea that we shouldn't be wasting money. So actually building the use of data into those sorts of paradigms is, I think, the way we need to get through. My bank makes me safer by monitoring whether or not I spend money in odd places, and it rings me up and asks me if I use my credit card. My supermarket tracks my spending and makes sure that the things that I usually buy are likely to be there. And actually what they're doing there is they are treating me as partners. I know I'm a junior partner. I know that the membership is really giving them money. But essentially I get a sense of I get something back for this. We've lost that connection for research. We've lost the idea that you're doing something which is a mutual benefit. And even if you don't get something from this research project, you're getting something for you and your family from the fact that we are research intensive. So we want to think in terms of partnership, and we need to reframe the partnerships, because what we're dealing with is what I like to say is the shadow of the bad pharma. It's not that I don't think that there's good things in the work that Ben Goldacre has done. I think they've overshadowed the progress that's actually been made. It makes it very difficult for us to give credit for really good practice in journals when you keep saying you can't publish unsuccessful trials and results, but you can. And you keep saying we don't have enough transparency of the data, but journals are doing really imaginative things about making data accessible, and so is industry. And we've allowed the thinking that industry is bad and academics are good, but actually we have problems with, I'm sure you don't, but we have problems generally with academics only publishing favourable results, not publishing at all. We create the incentives to hype. The whole REF process encourages us to compete rather than collaborate, and the tendency of people to say this is my data set and no one else is having their hands on it is every bit as intense in academia as it is in industry, if not more. So what we need to do is to build confidence in the fact that we are doing it with the public, for the public, and that our interests are aligned and not in conflict. And that is a major challenge, and there'll be some work coming out from the Academy of Medical Sciences probably next month, which reviews what we need to do to enable us to use evidence better in clinical care and public debate, and it would include some material on conflicts of interest. So that feels like a big challenge. The good news is that at least one of the major challenges we've got, which is integrating this in the service, is now a big political priority. The mandate for NHS England, which was issued just a few weeks ago, had one of its 7 objectives is that the NHS England needs to support and harness the research opportunities. We're very pleased because they should be helping us, although actually they already have statutory duties to collaborate with us, and every bit of the NHS has a statutory obligation to use evidence and promote the creation of evidence. So it isn't that the system's not there, it's that the culture is not delivering what it's designed to do. And at least then we have some leverage to expose what it is that is limiting our ability to get the cultural change in the NHS, of which the biggest single thing is lack of money. But we can talk about in questions. So where do we want to be? Well, I want to give the last word to one of our patients who works with us, and we try to inform all the things that we do by the views of patients. Richard Stevens tells us and tells us regularly at conferences that he's very lucky because of research. Without health research, we'll never have a secure evidence base of what's worked, what doesn't, and for whom and why. And as a survivor of 2 cancers and a heart attack, he says that's his personal experience. He had his life saved by a procedure that was only possible through research and cancer drugs built on the sort of research that you. So actually we share the aspiration that we should all be able to say out of this system for health and social care research, we should be able to be proud of the part we've played in research because it's improving health outcomes and lives of many, many people here and around the world. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, absolutely brilliant and very thought-provoking. So we have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions. Yeah, straight at the back there.
Thank you very much indeed. My questions have evolved nations, cross-border questions. You talked about people with the association with Great Britain. I very recently adopted UK address, but obviously there are significant issues of cross-border emissions and so on and so forth. Could you give us a little insight into that?
Yes, so I need to say, first of all, that there are some things I might say off the record if you have a cup of coffee with me, and on the record. I think Brexit has concentrated the mind enormously, and I think we've had a whole series of questions in which people felt they were protecting their turf, and now actually the game is about trying to do things together. So I think, for a very sad reason, that's helpful. I think we have a much more complex system in England than the other parts of, I can't really speak for Southern Ireland, but I can speak a bit about what goes on in the rest of the UK. And so the problems we've been trying to solve are much easier to solve and broadly have been solved in the other governments because they have fewer players in the system. So Scotland particularly has been able to coordinate things much earlier than we did. And then we've been therefore negotiating on how we can solve the England problems without undermining the progress that's been made in other places. And that's been trickier than I imagined it would be. But we've now identified a work programme, and I just flacked up on one slide, which has 4 particular things that have become exposed as continuing problems despite the agreement to move this forward. And so we're at a stage of turning that into a work programme and trying to deal with it. What I'd say in practice is that in all the regulatory organisations, people are talking to each other and trying to make it work. So if you're not clear what the pathway is on something, we will try and help sort that out if you make contact with us. I do think we're going to solve that reasonably soon. I couldn't have said that a year ago because there were too many tensions, but I can say that now, and no, I'm happy to talk about that outside.
So I can see 3 questions, and we'll take all 3. And could you just say who you are and where you're from? I think would be helpful.
So Maurice Brand from QMUL, and I mean, I've been at the sort of cutting edge of clinical research since the largely good old days of Hammersmith, where you could have a thought in the bar one night and be into patients within a couple of months. So a couple of constructive suggestions and a couple of comments. One is the metric of industry is all very well, but I'd like to see a metric of the number of clinical research fellows who actually get into doing clinical research and don't get diverted in other directions. The other, maybe more quixotic, is we should have the principle that all patients in a teaching hospital are taking part in research. So how about penalizing teaching hospitals for every patient that's not in a research study? And then 2 sort of more dystopian thoughts. The figures for increased, or rather reduced time getting to patients after HRA approval look good, but there has been a knock-on effect in taking much longer to get to ethics. And what the trusts are doing is using the HRA as an excuse for introducing all sorts of checks in advance. And so some thought how to get around that. And lastly, picking up your middle management problem, and my perception, maybe unfair, is that what's happened during the days of R&D, meaning anything but research and development, is they have a large number of people who, to put it kindly, are not experienced or competent at doing research, and so they have to justify their jobs by blocking it.
Whilst we're changing the microphone over, do you want to make a quick comment?
I'd make a quick comment, which is those are helpful in terms of metrics. I'm not so sure that we want to push teaching hospitals separately, because actually we've got really good examples of spreading research, so I prefer to go for all hospitals. I completely recognise the behaviours before it gets to us, and I think our bit of that is we have to show why you can trust what we're doing, and then we can put pressure on people to stop doing it.
Okay, next question.
Mike Ehrenstein, UCL. I'm a chief investigator for an academic-led blind clinical trial, and the system isn't really working. A couple of points I want to highlight. One is after you've given your approval, I'm running a multi-center study. It certainly isn't the case that all the hospitals then open their sites, and there's a considerable delay while each R&D office views the trial, costs it, etc., etc., etc. And I wondered whether the HRA could have some input into that and change that culture. The second thing is really the time it takes to change clinicians' perspective. You talked about partnership with patients, but it's also partnership with clinicians to realize that they need to see the trials that they are conducting as a kind of a shared ownership, rather than one person driving a trial, but having shared ownership and trying to change culture of clinicians as well.
There was one other up there somewhere. I can't remember who it was. But
so just quickly on those, I mean, I think the site setup is very similar to the previous one. We need to build confidence in it. They shouldn't feel the need to do that, but they still do. And I absolutely agree on clinician participant partnerships.
Okay, next one. And we're going to have to finish in about 1 minute, 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Thank you. Nick Harvey, Southampton. Really just a quick point along the lines of some of the previous thoughts. So as a PI of an multi-centre study, again, issues about real heterogeneity in terms of response around the country. But I just wondered, you commented a lot about the middle management sort of blockages. And is there a way that you can influence that directly, or is that more of a sort of top-down and hoping that it percolates through the system?
I think it's really difficult to get to middle management because you can get to the top and you can get to the bottom, but you can't easily identify the middle. We're working on it, but I think it's difficult.
Rebecca Fitzgerald, Cambridge. I know time is short, but can I suggest that one size doesn't fit all for clinical trials, and for a diagnostic device, for example, that's not the same as a first-time-in-man drug trial, and that's one of the problems that I'm certainly facing with a novel diagnostic, 8 months in setup to get the trial going.
Yeah, we're absolutely committed to that, and we see it as a Brexit opportunity.
And we'll take one last question. Jonathan, I'm sure.
Hi, it's Steve Powers, UCL, but I'm going to talk as Medical Director of the Royal Free. So I won't comment on your comments on DeepMind, although I'm very happy to comment if you wish and talk to you about it later. But I want to comment on the issue of the middle management, which I prefer to call the operational core of the hospitals. And I think what you said very much mirrors some external research we commissioned on how we are viewed as an organisation in terms of research, and it very much mirrored that the top of the shop gets it, but when you get into the operational core, that message gets lost. And actually, the agenda for the operational core of the hospitals is set nationally by NHS Improvement and NHS England. And the operational core of my organisation at the moment is responding on a daily basis to requests from NHS Improvement and others to fill in templates around A&E performance and cancer performance. And frankly, R&D comes to the bottom of the pile on that, because that's not what the agenda that's set. So I wouldn't talk to the CQC if I were you. I would talk to NHS Improvement, the productivity agenda that Lord Carter is leading. I'd ask where R&D sits in the model hospital that's been delivered. I get concerned about things that I hear about teaching hospitals not being very productive because they do things that we don't measure or we can't see, and actually what they do is this sort of stuff. And I think that's where you grab the agenda back, and that's how you change how operational cores of the hospital prioritise R&D.
I don't disagree with that entirely. I've had experience of lots of Carter reviews that have not achieved very much. Getting into board agendas and monitoring, CQC is one way into that, because it's the same type of agenda, and it's seizing the opportunities. So any doors that you think could be kicked open, I'll be grateful to receive.
We do, of course, know somebody quite close to the top of NHS England from this institution, don't we? So maybe we can exert some influence. Jonathan, I think you've provoked a lot of discussion. It was a brilliant talk, and I'd just like to invite everyone to join me in thanking you again.